The last entry in his journal reads, "They're watching me through the walls. I can hear them breathing. I have been awake for 11 days. Then the handwriting stops. Not because the pen ran dry, because Subject 89 was no longer capable of holding one. His name was Harold Blower. He was a 42-year-old professional tennis player from New York City, athletic, sharp, socially connected. In the winter of 1952, he checked himself into the New York State Psychiatric Institute following a painful divorce. He wasn't delusional. He wasn't dangerous. By most accounts, he was a man dealing with depression the way men of his era did, reluctantly, privately, hoping a few weeks of rest would set things right. He told friends he'd be back on the courts by spring. He never left the institute. What Blower didn't know, what nobody told him, was that he hadn't just checked into a psychiatric facility. He had walked directly into a covert military research program. The doctors treating him were also contractors. The medications they injected into his arm were not medications at all. They were experimental derivatives of mescaline, developed under a classified U.S. Army Chemical Corps project exploring the potential of psychochemical warfare. The goal wasn't to heal Harold Blower. The goal was to see what happened when you pushed the human mind past its breaking point. Over the course of several weeks, Blower received 5 injections. Each one was larger than the last. He protested. He begged them to stop. Documented records from the institute show he told staff directly that the injections made him feel like he was dying. The researchers noted his distress, adjusted their dosages, and continued. Because in the logic of the program, his suffering wasn't a problem to be solved, it was data to be collected. On January 8, 1953, Blower received the 5th and final injection, a dose of a synthetic mescaline compound called EA1298, administered at a concentration roughly 5 times higher than any previous session. Within minutes, he began convulsing. His heart stopped. He was pronounced dead 3 hours later. He was 42 years old. The official cause of death listed on his certificate? Unknown. His family was told he died of a heart condition. They believed it for 23 years. But here's what they don't tell you in the sanitized version of this story. Harold Blower wasn't alone. He was one piece of a much larger machine, a machine fueled not just by Cold War paranoia, but by money, serious institutional money. In the early 1950s, the U.S. Army Chemical Corps was operating with classified research budgets that in today's terms ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars. Programs exploring psychochemical agents, mind control, and behavioral manipulation had become a growth industry inside the defense establishment. The CIA's parallel program, MKUltra, would later become the infamous headline, but the Army's own operations were running simultaneously, largely through university hospitals and psychiatric institutions that received federal contracts in exchange for access to patients. Real estate mattered here too. These weren't backroom operations. They were embedded inside legitimate, prestigious medical facilities, which gave the research a veneer of clinical authority and insulated the military from direct scrutiny. The New York State Psychiatric Institute occupied prime Manhattan real estate and commanded enormous institutional credibility. That credibility was part of the transaction. The pharmaceutical compounds being tested weren't cheap to synthesize, and the Army's investment in psychochemical research represented a strategic bet that the next war might be won not with bullets, but with chemicals that could disorient, incapacitate, or psychologically destroy enemy forces at scale. Harold Blower was, in the coldest financial terms, a research asset. His value to the program was his body and his proximity. His consent was never part of the equation because consent would have made the research more expensive, more complicated, and more visible. When his family finally learned the truth in 1975 after a reporter uncovered classified documents, they sued. The U.S. government settled for $702,000. Not an admission of guilt, a transaction. The cost of keeping it quiet, assigned a dollar value, paid out, and filed away. This isn't just history. This is a template. The pattern you just heard, vulnerable people used as research subjects inside institutions they trusted, funded by government money, obscured by classification, and resolved through quiet financial settlements, didn't end in 1953. MKUltra ran through the 1970s. The Tuskegee syphilis study, in which black men in Alabama were deliberately denied treatment for decades so researchers could observe the disease's progression, wasn't terminated until 1972. In Guatemala, from 1946 to 1948, U.S. government researchers deliberately infected prisoners and psychiatric patients with syphilis and gonorrhea without consent to study antibiotic treatments. The U.S. government formally apologized for that program in 2010, 54 years after it ended. And the uncomfortable question that history keeps forcing us to ask is, where is the line between then and now? Today, pharmaceutical companies run clinical trials in developing nations where regulatory oversight is weaker and participants are more economically desperate. Today, data brokers harvest behavioral and psychological information from millions of people who signed terms of service they never read. The architecture is cleaner, the language is more palatable, the financial incentives are identical. We've been taught to think of programs like the one that killed Harold Blower as aberrations, dark chapters from a more brutal era. But the truth is, they were the logical outcome of a system that had already decided certain lives were worth less than certain answers. The real monster in Harold Blower's story wasn't a rogue scientist or a sadistic doctor. It was a procurement structure, a contract, a budget line, an institution that had built a wall between its financial interests and its moral obligations, and had decided that wall was load-bearing. His journal entries are still held in archives. His last coherent one was written 4 days before his death. He wrote that he wanted to go home, that he missed playing tennis, that he was scared. He was not a symbol or a cautionary tale when he wrote those words. He was a man who had made the mistake of trusting the people who were supposed to help him. So here's the question I want you to sit with. If this program ran for years inside a respected Manhattan hospital, funded by the U.S. government, concealed from families until reporters uncovered it 20 decades later, what programs are running right now inside institutions you trust that won't become public knowledge in 2045? If history has taught us anything, it's that the answer to that question is never none. Subscribe if you're not willing to wait 20 years to find out.